For years, Sumit made one position almost impossible to misunderstand. India was his home, India was where he wanted his future, and moving permanently to America was never supposed to become part of the plan. Jenny accepted that reality even when accepting it cost her almost everything familiar, because she left behind her home, her daughters, her independence, and the comfortable life she understood in order to build a marriage around Sumit in India. Now, with Jenny facing the most frightening health crisis of their marriage, and America suddenly becoming part of the treatment conversation, Sumit appears more determined than ever to secure a US visa, and that creates a question much bigger than paperwork. What happened to the man who once seemed so certain that leaving India was not an option? And why does America suddenly feel urgent only when Jenny may have no other choice? The obvious explanation would be that Sumit is doing exactly what any husband should do when the person he loves becomes vulnerable. But even that explanation reveals how dramatically their marriage has changed, because Jenny spent years making sacrifices that Sumit never had to make himself. She was the one who crossed the world, entered a completely different culture, tried to win over a family that did not want their relationship, and repeatedly adjusted her expectations whenever another obstacle appeared. Every time the future became complicated, Jenny seemed to be the person asked to stretch a little farther, wait a little longer, forgive another disappointment, or accept another condition, because walking away would mean losing the relationship she had already sacrificed so much to protect. That imbalance became almost normal, because viewers watched it happen gradually. But Jenny's medical crisis has suddenly placed those old decisions under a completely different light. A sacrifice that once looked romantic can feel very different when the person who made it becomes the one who needs support. Because Jenny no longer appears to be in a position where she can simply keep adapting to whatever is easiest for Sumit. If treatment in America becomes necessary, or if being close to her daughters becomes essential during recovery, then geography is no longer a preference they can debate casually. It becomes part of Jenny's safety, her support system, and potentially her ability to get through the hardest period she has faced since marrying Sumit. That means Sumit may finally be standing at the same crossroads Jenny faced years ago, except this time the direction has been reversed completely. Jenny once had to decide whether she could leave America behind for the man she loved, while Sumit may now have to decide whether his attachment to India matters more than being physically beside Jenny when she needs him most. The comparison is uncomfortable because nobody wants a health emergency to become some kind of relationship test. But major crises often expose parts of a marriage that daily life allows people to avoid. Couples can postpone discussions about sacrifice, responsibility, family, and long-term plans for years, until one event suddenly removes the luxury of waiting. What makes Sumit's sudden urgency especially interesting is that America was never presented as some secret dream he had been waiting to chase. Quite the opposite. Because his life remained deeply connected to India through his family, his culture, his routines, and the identity he had spent his entire life building there. Even after Jenny demonstrated how much she was willing to leave behind, Sumit never seemed eager to create the opposite arrangement and follow her back to the United States. For him, India was not simply an address on a passport. It represented the place where he knew how everything worked, where his family history existed, and where he did not have to rebuild himself from the beginning. That is exactly why this visa situation carries more emotional weight than an ordinary travel decision. Because getting permission to enter the United States could represent Sumit opening a door that he spent years keeping closed. He may still insist that the move would only be temporary, and he may genuinely believe that once Jenny receives treatment they can return to India and continue their old life. But medical crises rarely respect neat timelines. A few weeks can become a few months, recovery can take longer than expected, doctors can recommend additional care, and family members can begin asking whether moving back immediately is really the safest choice for Jenny. Suddenly, Sumit would be dealing with a future he never prepared himself to imagine. Because traveling to America for Jenny is one thing, while potentially building part of their life there is something much bigger. He would become the newcomer instead of Jenny, and many of the frustrations she experienced after arriving in India could become problems he finally understands personally. He might depend on Jenny's daughters for information, transportation, support, or simply help understanding how daily life works around him. And that would place Sumit in an emotional position he has rarely occupied during their marriage. For years, Jenny was the outsider trying to fit herself into Sumit's world, but America would place Sumit inside Jenny's world, where she understands the language, the culture, the family dynamics, and the social environment better than he does. Even if nobody intends to create a power shift, one would naturally occur, because Jenny would no longer be the person constantly asking Sumit what comes next. Sumit could suddenly find himself looking to Jenny and her family for answers. And that experience might force him to understand something about her sacrifices that conversations alone never managed to teach him. That possibility becomes even more emotional when you consider how much tension Jenny endured with Sumit's family simply because she chose to stay. She spent years living with the knowledge that some of the people closest to Sumit did not fully accept their marriage, and every argument placed Sumit between his wife and the family he had known his entire life. Jenny could have returned to America and ended that pressure whenever she wanted. Yet she continued trying to make India work, because being with Sumit mattered more to her than living somewhere familiar. Now imagine the roles being reversed, and Sumit arriving in America during Jenny's medical crisis, surrounded by daughters who have watched their mother spend years fighting for this marriage. Even without anyone openly attacking him, there could be enormous emotional pressure, because Jenny's family may naturally ask whether Sumit is ready to give her the same commitment she gave him. They would not necessarily need to say those words directly, because the comparison would already be present, especially if Jenny's condition requires long-term help and Sumit begins discussing how quickly he wants to return to India. That is where the situation could become genuinely complicated, because Sumit's desire to remain close to his own family would still be understandable, even while Jenny's need for support in America is equally understandable. A dramatic marriage story becomes much more interesting when there is no easy villain, because Sumit does not suddenly become selfish simply because leaving India is painful for him, just as Jenny does not become demanding because her health may require changes neither of them wanted. The tension comes from two valid realities colliding at the worst possible moment. There is also another reason the visa urgency feels different now, because Sumit may finally understand that having options matters more than defending one permanent plan. Years ago, he could confidently say that India was home because there was no immediate reason forcing him to consider anything else. Jenny was there, they were together, and despite family conflicts and financial struggles, their marriage existed within a system they had learned to manage. A health crisis destroys that sense of predictability, because suddenly the couple must think about hospitals, caregivers, family assistance, travel permissions, recovery periods, and what happens if Jenny cannot safely return to the same routine. Under those circumstances, a U.S. visa does not automatically mean Sumit secretly wanted an American life all along, because it could simply mean he realizes how dangerous it would be to have no way of accompanying Jenny if she needs to leave quickly. That explanation may actually be the most reasonable one, yet it still creates a major emotional reveal about Sumit's priorities, because the man who once considered America unnecessary may now see access to America as essential. His beliefs may not have changed because someone convinced him. They may have changed because fear finally made the consequences real. There is a major difference between discussing sacrifice when everybody is healthy and understanding sacrifice when your partner could genuinely need you. During ordinary disagreements, people protect routines because those routines feel permanent. But during emergencies, the question becomes much more basic. If Jenny goes, does Sumit go with her? If the answer is yes, then everything else becomes secondary, including the discomfort of leaving India, the uncertainty of starting somewhere unfamiliar, and the possibility that the temporary move lasts much longer than either of them expect. However, there is another question sitting underneath that explanation, and it is the one viewers are likely to debate hardest. If Jenny had never faced this medical crisis, would Sumit ever have reconsidered America at all? The answer may very well be no, but that does not necessarily expose some hidden motive, because people often change only when life forces them to confront a situation they never expected. Sumit could have spent the rest of his life believing that leaving India was unnecessary if nothing ever happened that made leaving necessary. The crisis may therefore be doing something years of arguments never accomplished, because it is forcing Sumit to see their marriage from Jenny's position instead of his own. Jenny once had to ask herself whether loving Sumit meant leaving behind the place where she felt secure, and Sumit may now be discovering that love can eventually demand the same painful question from both partners. The dramatic difference is that Jenny made her decision when their relationship was still trying to survive, while Sumit could be making his decision when Jenny's health has turned time into something neither of them wants to waste. That changes the emotional meaning of everything, because Sumit would no longer be considering America as an adventure, or an opportunity. He would be considering it because the woman who rearranged her entire life for him may now need him to rearrange his life for her. There is something almost painfully symmetrical about that possibility, especially when you remember how many times Jenny appeared to wonder whether she had sacrificed too much while waiting for Sumit to choose their relationship openly. Jenny's daughters could also become a major part of the pressure surrounding this decision, because their perspective would naturally be different from Sumit. They remember the life Jenny had before India, and they watched from thousands of miles away while she dealt with uncertainty, family opposition, and repeated complications surrounding a relationship that consumed years of her life. If their mother now needs medical support, they may not care about preserving the old arrangement simply because India became Jenny and Sumit's marital home. From their perspective, bringing Jenny closer could feel obvious, while Sumit may see that same move as the beginning of losing the life they fought so hard to build. That difference alone could create tension even if everyone genuinely wants the same outcome, because family members dealing with fear often become more protective and less patient with compromises. Jenny's daughters could reasonably believe their mother has already sacrificed enough, while Sumit could reasonably believe that abandoning India permanently was never part of their agreement. The most revealing moment would come if somebody finally says what everyone has probably been thinking. Jenny left America for Sumit, so why should Sumit hesitate to leave India for Jenny now? On the surface, that sounds completely fair, but relationships do not always work like an account where every sacrifice must be repaid with an identical sacrifice later. Jenny chose to relocate because she believed that was the only way their relationship could survive, while Sumit may now be choosing whether to relocate because he believes that is the only way to support Jenny properly. The motivations are different, but the emotional cost could be remarkably similar, and that is why Sumit's decision could redefine how viewers understand their marriage. If he moves without constantly reminding Jenny of everything he left behind, he could finally demonstrate a kind of commitment that words cannot prove. If he treats the situation as something he is doing reluctantly and spends the entire time focused on returning to India, however, Jenny may begin questioning whether the balance between them ever truly changed. That would be especially painful, because medical recovery can make people emotionally vulnerable in ways they never expected. Jenny may need reassurance that Sumit is there because he wants to support her, rather than because circumstances trapped him into following her. And even small comments about missing India could hit differently when she already feels responsible for changing his life. Sumit would have to understand that being physically present may not be enough if Jenny spends every day worrying that her health is destroying the future he wanted. At the same time, Sumit could be dealing with his own fear quietly, because moving to another country while worrying about your spouse is not some simple romantic sacrifice. He might be terrified about Jenny, worried about his family, confused about how long they will remain away, and uncomfortable admitting that he no longer knows what their future looks like. The strongest version of this situation is not Sumit confidently deciding that America is suddenly better, because it is Sumit realizing that the future he carefully imagined may no longer exist in the form he expected. That uncertainty could explain the visa urgency better than any secret theory ever could. When life becomes unstable, people try to control whatever they still can. And obtaining travel permission could be one practical thing Sumit feels capable of solving, while everything else remains frighteningly uncertain. He cannot personally guarantee Jenny's recovery, he cannot control how treatment progresses, and he cannot know whether they will return to India quickly. But he can make sure bureaucracy does not separate them at the worst possible moment. Viewed that way, the visa becomes less about America and more about access to Jenny, which changes the entire emotional interpretation. Sumit may not be chasing a new country at all. He may simply be refusing to let a border decide whether he can stand beside his wife. That would make his urgency deeply understandable. But it would also highlight how much he has changed from the man viewers first watched struggling to balance Jenny against nearly every other part of his life. There was a time when family pressure could delay Sumit's decisions for months or years, while Jenny was left wondering whether he would ever choose their relationship without hesitation. Now the possibility of Jenny leaving for treatment could produce a completely different reaction, because hesitation carries consequences that are impossible to ignore. Sumit may have finally reached a point where losing comfort feels less frightening than losing time with Jenny, and if that is what changed, then the visa conversation represents something much bigger than travel. It represents priorities becoming brutally clear. Yet even if Sumit makes the move, another fascinating problem begins immediately, because America could change the relationship dynamic in ways neither of them expects. Jenny spent years depending on Sumit's knowledge of India, but once they arrive in her home country, that dependency could disappear almost overnight. She would know the environment, understand the systems, reconnect with family, and regain a support network that exists independently from Sumit. For someone who has spent years shaping her daily life around her marriage, that renewed independence could change Jenny emotionally. She may start seeing herself less as the woman who needs to make India work at any cost, and more as someone who has choices again, especially if her daughters are constantly nearby reminding her that she does not have to face everything alone. Sumit could notice that shift too, and even if he supports it completely, adjusting to a stronger and more independent Jenny could alter the marriage they both became accustomed to. This is where the reversal becomes more than geographical, because Sumit might finally become the person adapting while Jenny becomes the person surrounded by familiarity. He could experience loneliness when Jenny's daughters return to their own routines, confusion about cultural expectations, frustration over paperwork, and the strange feeling of being present in a place where almost everything belongs more naturally to his wife than to him. Those experiences would not magically make him understand every challenge Jenny faced in India, but they could give him a perspective he never had before. There could even be moments where Sumit realizes that Jenny rarely complained about certain sacrifices because she was too focused on protecting the marriage. Missing familiar food, missing family gatherings, feeling isolated during conflict, or simply wanting to speak with people who understand your background can seem like small problems until you experience them daily. If Sumit begins feeling those emotions in America, Jenny may finally hear him describing feelings she carried quietly for years. That kind of realization could actually strengthen them, because mutual sacrifice creates a different form of respect. Jenny may stop feeling like she carried the relationship across every difficult bridge alone, while Sumit may finally recognize the emotional price she paid long before he was ready to make the same journey. Instead of the medical crisis destroying their marriage, the experience could force them into a more balanced partnership than they ever managed to create under normal circumstances. However, the opposite outcome cannot be ignored, because crisis also magnifies unresolved resentment. Jenny could begin remembering every time she felt abandoned while watching Sumit struggle with one relocation. And Sumit could become defensive if he feels his sacrifices are being compared constantly to hers. The conversation could quickly shift from supporting Jenny's recovery to keeping score, and once couples begin measuring who suffered more, even compassionate decisions can become sources of bitterness. Imagine Jenny telling Sumit that she never complained this much when she moved to India, only for Sumit to respond that the situations were completely different, because Jenny chose India voluntarily while he came to America because of a medical emergency. Both could believe they are being reasonable, yet the argument would reveal something much deeper about how differently they remember the history of their marriage. Jenny might remember sacrifice, while Sumit remembers circumstances neither of them could control. That is why this move, if it happens, would not automatically fix every old problem simply because the roles finally reverse. The value would come from what Sumit learns and how Jenny responds, not from the plane ticket itself. If Sumit genuinely embraces the responsibility of being Jenny's primary support, without treating his move as a debt she must repay later, then viewers could be witnessing one of the most meaningful changes in his character. The medical crisis could also force Jenny to confront something she may have avoided, because she was always the stronger pursuer in their relationship. For years, she fought to make their marriage happen, but now she may have to trust Sumit to take control of practical decisions when she does not have the same energy. That shift could be frightening for someone who spent so much time pushing their relationship forward whenever Sumit hesitated. Jenny may suddenly need Sumit to become the person calling, planning, preparing, arranging documents, handling travel, and deciding what comes next, while she focuses on getting stronger. If Sumit rises to that responsibility, the dynamic between them changes again, because Jenny no longer has to be the person carrying the emotional weight of keeping everything together. If he struggles, however, old doubts could return at the exact moment she is least capable of managing them. There is also the question of what happens after the immediate danger passes, because temporary decisions often become permanent through simple momentum. Suppose Jenny receives treatment in America, begins recovering near her daughters, and realizes how much easier certain parts of daily life feel with family close by. Returning to India might no longer seem as obvious as it did before the crisis, especially if doctors recommend continued monitoring, or if Jenny simply feels safer remaining near a larger support system. Sumit could then face the real decision he has avoided for years, because accompanying Jenny for treatment would be one sacrifice, while agreeing to build a longer future in America would be another entirely. The first could be explained as necessity, but the second would require him to reconsider what home means after marriage. Would home still be the country where he was born, or could home become wherever Jenny has the strongest chance of living safely and comfortably? That question could become the defining conflict of their next chapter, because neither answer would erase what came before. India contains their memories, their victories, their hardest battles, and the marriage they fought to build despite enormous opposition. America contains Jenny's history, her daughters, and potentially the support she may need as health becomes a more serious part of their future. Choosing between those two places would therefore feel like choosing between two versions of their marriage. India represents the marriage Jenny sacrificed to enter, while America could represent the marriage Sumit must now sacrifice to protect. That symbolism is almost impossible to ignore, and it explains why something as ordinary as a visa application can suddenly feel like the biggest relationship decision they have faced in years. Sumit's family could complicate everything again, because his departure would not happen in an emotional vacuum. Even if they have become more accepting of Jenny, watching Sumit leave India because of her health could trigger fears that the temporary move will become permanent. Parents who spent years worrying about losing their son to this relationship could easily see America as the final step in exactly what they once feared. Sumit could reassure them repeatedly that he plans to return, but those promises become difficult to guarantee when Jenny's health determines the timeline. Every extension could create more pressure. Every change in treatment could produce new uncertainty, and every conversation about staying longer could reopen old wounds between Sumit and his family. Jenny might then feel guilty all over again, except this time the guilt would not come from simply being married to Sumit. It would come from believing her health is pulling him away from everything he loves. That emotional burden could become dangerous for Jenny, because people going through serious health problems already struggle with feeling like they have become a burden on their families. Sumit would need to make one thing very clear through his behavior: following Jenny is his decision, not something she forced him to do. The difference between those two interpretations could determine whether Jenny feels supported or responsible for his unhappiness. This is where viewers may finally see whether Sumit's priorities have truly changed, because anybody can say they would do anything for their spouse during an emotional conversation. The difficult part is continuing to mean it after weeks of stress, uncertainty, homesickness, paperwork, family pressure, and disrupted plans. Commitment becomes visible in the boring and frustrating days after the dramatic decision has already been made. If Sumit remains steady through those moments, then the U.S. visa story stops looking suspicious and starts looking like the final proof that Jenny is no longer the only person willing to turn her life upside down for their marriage. He would not be erasing the sacrifices she made, because nothing can give Jenny those years back. But he could finally demonstrate that sacrifice in their relationship is capable of moving in both directions. That would be a very different Sumit from the man viewers once watched hesitate repeatedly while Jenny waited for certainty. It would suggest that the years they spent together changed him more deeply than he realized, and that the possibility of losing the life they built together finally taught him what mattered most. Sometimes people do not abandon old priorities because those priorities were fake. They abandon them because something more important finally appears. Jenny's crisis may be that something. The most powerful part of this entire situation is therefore not whether Sumit suddenly likes America, because he may never prefer America and he may spend every day there missing India. The real question is whether preference still matters when Jenny needs him somewhere else. Jenny already answered that question years ago when she chose Sumit over the life she understood. And now circumstances may be demanding Sumit's answer in return. If he gets the visa, boards the plane, stays through Jenny's treatment, handles the uncertainty, supports her without resentment, and accepts that their future may no longer look the way he planned, then this crisis could completely rewrite the emotional balance of their marriage. Jenny would finally see Sumit make a sacrifice that cannot be explained away as words, promises, or good intentions, because he would be leaving his own comfort behind to protect hers. If he hesitates once the reality becomes difficult, however, then every old question about imbalance could return stronger than before. Jenny could begin wondering whether she spent years proving a level of commitment that Sumit was only comfortable accepting when he was not required to match it, while Sumit could feel unfairly judged for struggling with a decision nobody would find easy. There is no simple answer, because love does not remove attachment to family, culture, or home, and being committed to Jenny does not require Sumit to stop loving India. The real test is whether he can carry both truths at once, missing the life he knows, while still making Jenny feel that choosing her is not something he regrets. For years, Jenny was the one asked to prove how far she would go for Sumit, and she answered by crossing an ocean, rebuilding her life, surviving family rejection, and staying through challenges that could have ended the relationship many times. Now Jenny may be facing the one circumstance she cannot solve through determination alone. And Sumit may finally be the person required to cross that same ocean in the opposite direction. That is why his sudden urgency surrounding a US visa matters so much. Because the visa itself may only be a document, but what it represents could change everything viewers thought they understood about their marriage. Sumit spent years building a future around staying in India. Yet Jenny's health may have forced him to confront a truth stronger than any old promise about where he would live. Sometimes loving someone means giving up the plan you were absolutely certain you would never change. Jenny once changed her entire life because she believed being with Sumit was worth the sacrifice. And now Sumit may finally have to decide whether being with Jenny is worth making the exact kind of sacrifice he spent years avoiding. If he follows her to America, and remains beside her regardless of how long the recovery takes, it could become the moment their marriage finally feels balanced after years of Jenny carrying the heavier cost. But if America becomes more than a temporary medical stop, Sumit's hardest decision may actually come after Jenny starts getting better. Because supporting her during a crisis is one thing, while accepting that their permanent future could move away from India is something else entirely. That moment would reveal whether this visa represents temporary desperation or a genuine transformation in how Sumit now defines home, responsibility, and marriage. After everything Jenny gave up to build a life beside him, Sumit may finally be discovering that marriage does not always allow one person to remain comfortable while the other keeps adapting. Because sooner or later, life changes the direction of the sacrifice. Jenny crossed the world for Sumit when their love demanded it, and now the biggest question is whether Sumit will cross the world for Jenny when her life may demand it. This story is fictional for entertainment.